Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Emile Hokayem. I'm the Senior Fellow for Middle East Security here at the ISS. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. We have around 250 people registered for it. It's a sign of the great interest and the great concern there is over this issue these days. One that has been brewing for over a decade, and that seems to come on the top of the regional and possibly international agenda as we speak. There's a lot of crisis, but this is one that is capturing the minds and occupying the time and attention of major powers. This webinar is on the record, and there's a number of journalists attending, so welcome. I will take questions through the chat function later on. We'll show you how in the Q&A. We have four great panelists today who will each cover specific aspects of this crisis, the competition in the Eastern Mediterranean, over maritime borders, over energy, over strategic alliances, and so on. We at the ISS also cover this issue, primarily through the military and regional security dimensions, which we will address a little today. But our four speakers here each have very specific knowledge that will help us understand better and clarify the stakes in this crisis. I will briefly introduce the speakers. Their longer bios are available to all of you on the website and in the invitation. The first one will be John Bowlus, who's currently a researcher at Kadir Has University in Istanbul and is the editor-in-chief for Energy Reporters. Then we'll move to Sinan Ülgen, who is a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, where he works on Turkish foreign policy. He is a founding partner of Istanbul Economics, a chairman of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, a think tank, independent think tank in Istanbul as well. And Sinan has served in the Turkish Foreign Service in many capacities. Then we'll move to Ambassador Teresa Samatopoulos. Terry was the NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security Policy up until September 2016. He's currently with the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, ELIAMEP, and he served for many years as a senior Greek diplomat and ambassador working on EU, NATO, and other security policy issues. And finally, Ellen Libson is the director of the Masters in International Security Studies program at George Mason University. She was previously the president and CEO of the Simpson Center, a great think tank in Washington, D.C. And prior to that, she served as a senior U.S. intelligence and government official for 2 decades. So we have a great panoply, a combination of perspectives here. And what we're going to do is I'm going to start by asking questions from each of the panelists, and then we will turn to the Q&A from the audience. So we'll start with John, and we'll ask you to set the scene for us. Can you please walk us through the quite complex maritime border delineation disputes that underpin the current tensions?
Sure. I mean, it is quite complex, as you say, and so I'll give a broad overview. Essentially, what Greece and Turkey dispute are their rights to explore in what are called exclusive economic zones beyond their coastlines. There's a convention that came to kind of guidelines on these issues in 1982 called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that designated, number one, that countries have 200 nautical miles beyond their coastlines which gives them rights to subsea resource exploration, production, etc. The main bone of contention, Turkey accepts that, Greece accepts the 200-mile designation, is in regard to islands. And for anyone who's looked at the map in the Aegean, there are quite a few that populate that area. And the recent tension is, of course, around Cyprus. Turkey's dispute is that islands should not have they're allowed to have 12-mile territorial water designations, which permits them to do anything within those lines, but not the 200-mile nautical mile EEZ, as we say for short. So because hydrocarbons, gas has been discovered there starting in 2009 in the region, we've had a lot of focus there. And the first find, of course, in Cyprus was 2011 with the Aphrodite field. So this has kind of been the reason to kind of bring the powers there. I think it's worth kind of specifying, however, that these things get more complicated when you look at the Aegean. Turkey accepts the 12-mile nautical designation for territorial waters, again, different than EEZs, but not fully. They accept only up to 6 nautical miles, whereas Greece reserves the right to extend it up to 12 nautical miles. This is problematic, of course, because of, some of these islands are quite close to the Turkish shore. And then you have another issue of islands that are even closer than 6 nautical miles to the Turkish shore. Much attention has been drawn to a very small island, beautiful place, Castellarizo, that is less than 4 nautical miles off the Turkish coast. So in that case, Turkey doesn't even accept the 6-mile designation, if that's all clear. So there are all these kind of iterations. In the Aegean, the two countries have kind of come to, after 1974, really what was, one of the precipitating causes of the events of 1974 was the oil crisis, actually. And you see both countries kind of exploring for oil in the Aegean thereafter. And then, of course, all that kind of comes to a denouement in July 1974 when Turkey invades northern Cyprus. So, the fight for energy, has the ability to certainly stimulate tensions as we see today. They have kind of come to an agreement, I think, to kind of disagree on maritime borders at this point in the Aegean. Kind of live and let live. Turkey can pass through it as it wishes and go on. But the Cyprus issue, Turkey is not willing to live and let live. And, I would just encourage anyone to, if you want to get a better sense of why Turkey, on the one hand, Greece certainly has international law on its side with the UNCLOS Convention. But I would kind of, caution on that too, because the United States, Israel, Syria, and importantly, to this case, Turkey have not ratified it. Turkey, as I said, kind of accords with some of the things relating to UNCLOS, and they do fully in the Black Sea, for instance. But Turkey more has an argument towards kind of reasonability when you kind of look at the map and see, where islands are, and if you fully, enforce this 200-mile zone for EEZs, it essentially robs Turkey of almost any, it's very, very limited. So, it's a great topic, I would say.
Thank you. I mean, 2 quick points here. I mean, you said that international law is in Greece's favor. What I hear in Turkey, and I'm just describing here, is that it's a question also of equity. Is that how, it has to be equitable? Is that how it's being framed? Is that the fundamental tension here?
Yeah, that's generally what the Turkish government says and argues. There's, of course, these even go further back, of course, in the 1970s, at least in the Turkish mindset about, kind of having, for Turkey, one of the most important episodes was, losing the Mosul province of Iraq, which, the British, of course, assumed and, developed lots of oil from there. So in a deal that Turkey today does not think was fair, generally the Turkish historical mindset is that, we were kind of robbed of those revenues by the deal. So, that may be fair or not, but that's the perception in Turkey. So when it comes to new energy resources, Turkey is somewhat reluctant to kind of, stand down on these issues, I'd say. But, they would encourage everyone, I think, to look at the map more.
So the energy, the findings of these energy fields and the whole discussion in the past 10 decades about the development of fields, production pipelines, etc. has brought to the surface long-standing issues than actually created new ones. So energy in and of itself is not the driver of the competition. It just gave that long-standing competition a lot more strategic relevance for the various actors. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's partly fair. I'll get to why I do think it's more of an exacerbating factor to kind of igniting these age-old differences in a bit. But I think we need to remember that Cypriot gas is of extreme value to Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus. These are resources that could make a huge impact economically. Turkey, for instance, spent $12 billion last year to import gas. This is why their discovery in the Black Sea is such a big deal, even though it's not going to pay off for several years. All three of these countries are very, their gas supply security, as we call it, is fragile, and so they are important resources in and of themselves. That said, we have to kind of frame all this. I would say more so that it's almost more of a chance to kind of project power in the region. Of course, Turkey has become more, quote, aggressive in the region. You can point to Syria, and most importantly, Libya is, I think, the major flashpoint now, and kind of bringing this all out. I would also point to, say, France. Their actions in the region, I think, are also very much related to Libya. The gas in that respect is kind of encouraging these powers to fill power vacuums in the region and kind of flex their muscles there. However, the problem now with Cypriot gas is that 10 years ago when it was coming online, gas prices were high, supplies were tight. Europe was concerned about its dependence on Russian gas through pipelines that passed through Ukraine. But I'd say starting with the discovery of gas in the Zohr field in Egypt, which is a very, very large field, and kind of the coalescence of this, really a gas nexus between Israel and Egypt. There's so much gas there. That sort of helps satisfy. Of course, after 2015, gas prices have declined quite considerably. We're now at a point where Europe is swimming in gas. Prices, hit rock bottom during the Corona pandemic. You have tons of LNG coming on, particularly from the United States, which Turkey is increasingly taking more and more of. You have Qatar coming on in 2 or 3 years with huge new developments of gas. So, the urgency for this gas is just not what it was 10 years ago. So in some respects, the gas itself, just doesn't matter to Europe in particular, like it did 10 years ago. You add all to this, the uncertainty of the energy transition. How much is gas going to be in demand going forward? I'm not going to predict energy markets. They change very rapidly. But with concerns about climate change, gas has had a nice run here in terms of replacing coal in the United States and in Europe, and that's a good thing. But in terms of warming, we need to still reduce our emissions quite a bit, and so renewables need to surge a lot more, and gas competes with that. There is kind of a possibility for gas in the sense of hydrogen. I don't know how well your audience is aware of these issues, but the West and its Asian allies have kind of turned to hydrogen as a potential solution to the climate problem. Hydrogen is interesting because you can make it from gas after you take the carbon out so that it's clean. You can transport it in gas pipelines or oil pipelines, and it's geopolitically it's kind of the counterbalance, I would say, to China in this regard, because China has such a strong lead in renewable technology, particularly solar, but also wind, nuclear, and of course lithium-ion batteries. So, with that push, gas, I see gas having a strong demand, but I don't see it growing exponentially more going forward. So briefly, and I just wanted to
put this topic on the table to bring some optimism early to the discussion. Is there any scenario where there is energy cooperation that reduces or contains some of the tensions that we see right now? Or is that, has tensions become so big since now it touches on sovereignty and the posture, the regional power of those various countries? Is it a far-fetched scenario?
I mean, there's always reason for optimism, and gas actually, in oil, I can say, you rarely have seen kind of oil help solve, diplomatic tensions. Gas has not really solved them either, but it can certainly help relationships. A great example is the Soviet Union, now Russia, and Europe. It's a commercial enterprise at the end of the day, whereas oil is a strategic, more of a strategic commodity. In terms of this specific, and Turkey, I think, is also a great example along these lines of having, huge relations with Russia, of importing Russian gas, Iran. These are geopolitical rivals that, it's okay to trade with. So, that spirit, I think, can infect gas. One of the problems, one of the reasons that happened, though, is because pipelines were so critical to gas in kind of the early developments. And we're seeing a transition there, again, to liquefied natural gas transported. They freeze it down to 1/600th the volume and put it on tankers and can transport it now economically. Qatar really, started that process, launched that in the early 2000s. So because pipelines require such, incredible investments, you need to have trust and firm legal arrangements in place that can build these kinds of bilateral relationships. The LNG market is more of a, Wild West one where, cargoes are going to go wherever they're going to go. And we see the United States, for example, flexing its muscles in Europe. We've seen sanctions on Nord Stream 2 and as well as Turk Stream 2, which are not talked about as much. But that's all to kind of, block Russian gas from entering Europe so that US LNG can fill that market. So, there's more competition inherently now in gas. And I'll just kind of conclude, I guess, with talking about the issue at hand, bringing it back to the East Med. I think the Aegean is a nice example where, the two sides have kind of agreed to disagree and kind of ignore maritime borders to some extent and just get along and keep going. In theory, it's very easy. And I was genuinely optimistic, in 2014, 2015, that why can't you just develop the gas, in some commercial vehicle that distributes it to the island, simply based on demographics, and so it's just a revenue generation tool. It doesn't have to be political. Now, that requires compromise and cooperation that is, of course, lacking on both sides. There's not a particular side that needs to be blamed for that, but in theory, it's a very easy option. I do think you kind of have to bring Turkey into the equation, though, on some level to really develop these assets, and we've since seen, that not happen. So I'll leave it there. I'm sure others have many other things to point out there.
Thank you, Terry. Yes.
If I may come in just for a minute on 2 points that John made. To say, first of all, that I agree broadly on his, how shall I put it, economic assessment of the situation in terms of, the value of gas today as it was. But he's the expert, and I won't quibble with that. But as I said, I agree. But 2 things. First of all, to caution on the idea that you solve problems by demographics and by looking at maps. You mentioned Mosul, John. Part of the reason and the problem was that, you have these diplomats and politicians who are looking at maps and drawing lines. So in the 21st century, I think we need to put a different value on how we delineate and discuss and agree. And I think we need to be a little more sensitive as regards rule of law, and that goes for international law as well. Secondly, I think that energy can be used in a positive way to foster relations. I mean, even with Turkey, we have a pipeline, you know, TAP that goes, is going through from Turkey into Greece and then branching out to Bulgaria and crossing into Italy, and also the East Med Gas Forum, where you have Greece and Egypt and Cyprus, you have Jordan, but you also have Israel and Palestinians together on this forum. So yes, I think that it can be used in that. It depends how you approach it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Sinan, let's turn to you, please. And can you please describe for us the strategic perspective from Ankara on those issues? I mean, there's a lot of questions about what is the policy driver here. Is Turkey fearful of being isolated because of the development of alliances around it? Is Turkey animated by an intention to dominate the East Med? I mean, you know, these are two extremes, probably a combination of both. But can you walk us first through the strategic perspective?
Yes, when we look at these issues, I think we have to be cognizant that we're actually talking about different layers of problems. One that's already been referred to relates to Cyprus. And obviously, I won't go into details of the Cyprus conflict, but I'll tell you a little bit more about, you know, how it impacts the current stalemate. The second one are, you know, the set of bilateral issues between Turkey and Greece, and the continental shelf is just one of them. But there are many others from the Turkish perspective that actually have been discussed with Greece for the past, you know, almost 35 years. High-level diplomats have had now 63 rounds of discussions about these set of issues. They relate to territorial waters, to continental shelf, to demilitarization of islands, to air traffic, you know, air traffic routes, and so on. So there's a host of issues there, and that relate to the Aegean disputes. And with regard to the Eastern Mediterranean, the essential dispute is about the continental shelf, and by extension on the exclusive economic zone. Here, I will slightly disagree with John in the sense that, you know, Turkey does not believe that international law is on its side. Actually, on the contrary, on the East Med exclusively, Turkey believes that international law is on its side because of the situation of Castellorizo. Now, there are two issues there. I think we are witnessing the clash of two maximalist narratives. The Greek maximalist narrative is one that grants an extensive continental shelf to Castellorizo. I tend to think that that is very, very difficult to defend in front of an international court when you look at the international jurisprudence, which takes into account issues like proximity to the mainland, the exposure of the littoral to the mainland, the economic activity that there is on the island, the population, and so on. So I think it would be very difficult to argue that Castellorizo would have, you know, even a limited continental shelf. I'm not talking about territorial waters. In return, I think the Turkish policy that, and this is why I say that it's a clash of maximalist narratives, Turkish policy, which has been illustrated by the latest Turkey-Libya agreement, goes in the opposite direction and grants no continental shelf to the Greek islands like Rhodes and Crete, and just recognizes their territorial waters. So I think if we go to an international court on this specific issue, there would have to be concession on both sides. I think Turkey would find that its argument that Crete and Rhodes has no continental shelf would be, you know, not well received. And in return, Greece would find that its argument that Castellorizo has large or even a continental shelf would probably not be well received. But the fact of the matter is that Turkey, and then the question, of course, that everybody has when I reciprocate this way is, then why doesn't Turkey go to court? Well, the answer is that Turkey wants to go to court for a host of issues. But before we go to court, we have to agree with Greece, firstly, on the scope of the disputes that will be submitted to court. And there's a main disagreement on there, because Greece, the Greek point of view is that many of these issues, and I'm sure Ambassador Stamatopoulos will have more to say on this, is that some of these issues relate to Greek national sovereignty. They're not up for discussions with Turkey. That's not true, because we have been discussing these issues between diplomats for the past 30 years. But then we have to have this, negotiations, bilateral negotiations with Greece, in order to come to an understanding on what those disputes are that will be submitted to court. Firstly, secondly, it's about which legal norms we are going to submit to the international court. Of course, UNCLOS is part of those. But in addition to UNCLOS, there are other arguments to be made in terms of international norms. One of them is equity, indeed. So I think we have to come to an agreement about the legal norms that will be submitted for the international court to be able to adjudicate on those issues. So that's with regard to the ISMEC. Now, overall, strategically, when we look at Turkish policy there has indeed been escalation. And I find that this is driven by two particular dynamics. One is that Turkey increasingly relied on hard power in this zone, essentially to send two messages. One is that it does find itself diplomatically isolated, which is, to some extent, the result of its own foreign policy in the last decade in the Eastern Mediterranean with a number of different countries. But nonetheless, this diplomatic isolation has led Turkey to rely more on hard power. But the objective of that hard power is not in any way to drive to a settlement by itself, but it's twofold. One, to basically message the international community, particularly Greece, that Turkey will not accept the unilateral, and unfair repartition or distribution of the continental shelf in the East Med that is being planned with the exclusion of Turkey. So you can't gang up against Turkey and hope to achieve those aims. That's the first part of the message. And the second part of the message is that if we really want to solve this, we have to solve it through bilateral discussions, particularly with Greece. That's the second part of the message. So I think, some of that may have been overdone in terms of how much, hard power and the rather combative rhetoric that accompanied it. But nonetheless, ultimately, when you look at it, that was the objective. Now, that's with regard to Greece. Now, with regard to Cyprus, we have a different situation. It's more complicated because Turkey does not recognize, the government in Nicosia. It recognizes the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, and the international community, vice versa, does not recognize the TRNC. So we have a direct negotiation dilemma there. But nonetheless, the formula there's still a formula, and I certainly would be eager to hear the reaction of the respondents. And the formula is, we can put aside the issue of recognition because ultimately a political settlement in Cyprus is what's needed. The international community, Turks, Greeks, Cypriots have tried to get there to no avail since 1974, actually even before. And therefore, we can
still go, we can still try to get to a political settlement under the aegis of the UN. But nonetheless, there's another path that we can explore in order to diffuse the conflict over the energy resources. And that's the Condominium Principle, which is a principle recognized under international law as a way of settling border disputes. The Condominium Principle for Cyprus would essentially mean that the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots would essentially agree to jointly operate and distribute the revenues from any offshore findings. The issue there for the Greek Cypriots is that this should not be seen as being tantamount to recognition of the Turkish Cypriot entity. I can see that challenge, but nonetheless, there must be ways, novel ways, and this is possibly where an EU could play a role, to engineer a formula where we would have the condominium principle in place. And that, to me, is the way forward for the Cyprus part of the Eastern Med equation.
Thank you, Sinan. I mean, it is quite complicated indeed, so many layers. Let me ask you, and there's a, I get this question quite a lot. Is there a consensus in Turkey on the government policy in the East Med, whether on objectives or on methods? I mean, when I mean methods, it's the quite belligerent and provocative rhetoric that we hear and sometimes muscle flexing that we hear from Ankara. And if so, if there is a consensus, how strong it is, and which constituencies are really aligning behind the presidency on this?
Yeah, there is definitely a consensus on the principles, because we've talked, and John, I think, did a very good job.
Sinan, I think for a second the sound faded. Can you do it again?
Okay, there is indeed a consensus, a large consensus in Turkey on the principles, on the objectives, and I think John did a very good job in describing, elaborately the energy dimension of this. I think more important for Turkish society is the national sovereignty dimension of this problem. So that's really what tends to undergird also the complexity of this issue. It's not just about energy. It's not just about the prospects. It's also about national sovereignty, and that is why there is a consensus about the ultimate aims of this objective. There is less consensus on the methods. When I look at the domestic discussion in Turkey, there is indeed criticism of the methods, of the rhetoric, the very heavy rhetoric, and ultimately of the consequences of the foreign policy that where Turkey finds itself surrounded by an anti-Turkey opposition in the Mediterranean. So there's criticism about that domestically. But again, on the objectives, on the principles, there is by and large unanimity.
So, I mean, related to that then, I mean, this rhetoric that we hear, which is driving the headlines, to be honest, is it for domestic consumption? Is it because there is it reflects the maximalist narrative that you mentioned earlier? Is it a way to build leverage ahead of negotiations? I mean, how should we understand what comes out of President Erdogan's mouth? Is that, it's quite difficult because, we've been used in the past 10 years, as you say, for a Turkish foreign policy that is a lot more assertive, a lot more belligerent. So, on this particular issue, how should we interpret it?
Well, it's all of the above, Emile, to tell you the truth. It's about domestic consumption, but it's also about strong messaging. It's about deterrence. But ultimately, I mean, what you should look for, and I think that's what the Turkish government has been saying all along, is that ultimately what Turkey wants is direct negotiations. That, I think, is something that we have to keep in mind, despite this rather aggressive rhetoric. The direct negotiations is the only way forward, because I think the international community must also acknowledge at some point that you can't really put political pressure on Turkey to push Turkey and to corner it so that it walks back on what it sees as elements of its national sovereignty. The same can be said about Greece. Greece is not going to walk back just because Turkey is demonstrating hard power in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the only way really is direct negotiations. And there, I've already perhaps, tried to uncover three possible outcomes. One is, we agree, we shake hands, we solve our problems directly. The other one is we agree to disagree, and therefore, but we agree on a frame that can be submitted to international court. And thirdly, we can also explore some of these creative ways, like the condominium issue, for, not so much for Turkey and Greece, or even perhaps even between Turkey and Greece. I mean, I'm going to be a bit romantic here, but, that could also be on the table looking at all the continental shelf issues in the Aegean and in the Eastern Mediterranean. So one option to explore is, the condominium. Turkey and Greece agrees to do joint exploration, both in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. What's wrong about that? So all of these issues could be discussed. So that's going to be, the ultimate aim of Turkish policymakers, those direct negotiations.
Thank you, Sinan. Terry, turning to you, you have a lot of relevant experience, both with your Greek diplomatic hat and your NATO experience. So let me first talk to the former Greek official and analyst in you. How do you interpret what Turkey is doing? I mean, there is I also look at headlines in the Greek press and what comes out of the presidency and then the Greek government. Do they see it as outright aggression, or is it a Turkish bid to jumpstart negotiations? Because Sinan just told us that the best case scenario for Turkey is a direct negotiation, and he laid out three possible positive outcome. I mean, we're still a long way from there. So how is it perceived from your end?
Well, I listened very carefully to what Sinan had to say, and it's very interesting. Unfortunately, Sinan is not running Turkish foreign policy. Not that I agree totally with everything he says, but it would be, I think, a different ballgame. Whether Greece looks at Turkey as an aggressor, or whether these are all a precursor of difficult diplomatic negotiations. Let me start by saying that Greece has always approached Turkey as a neighbor, and as a neighboring country with which Greece would like to have positive, constructive, cooperative relations, as Greece has with all of its other neighbors, and even with some, particularly one to our north, where we had a serious disagreement for the last 2 decades. This has been solved, and now what is called the Republic of North Macedonia is a member of NATO with Greece's assistance. Let us not forget that Greece was one of the main countries arguing in favor of Turkey joining the European Union, to the point of having established a task force for transferring EU know-how, which I chaired. I was the Greek co-chair for a period of time, having relations with my Turkish counterparts to transfer this know-how and advance Turkey's road towards accession. But we all know that there have been problems there, which we needn't go into because that's another 3-hour discussion on its own. Turkey has engaged in very aggressive and provocative actions, I would say. I don't know if that qualifies Turkey as an aggressor, but the actions have been aggressive, and they have been provocative. And we've had an increase of this kind of behavior, which is not limited only to what happened recently in the Eastern Med, where you had these research ships, escorted by a huge number of naval vessels to impose Turkish will. But if you allow me, I'm not a statistics guy, but just to give an idea of what I'm talking about, just on the bilateral scope that Sinan mentioned, from the 1st of the year until the 31st of August, we have had 3,970 violations of Greek airspace by Turkish fighter aircraft, and 364 overflights of Greek territory, including residential areas. Add to that 2,049 violations of Greek territorial waters by Turkish naval vessels. So, I mean, this is an indication of the scope of what's happening. Now, I think that we need to try and understand Turkish behavior more generally. And if you allow me in 3 minutes, I'll try to be telegraphic about it. You know, that is a 10-hour discussion, but I'll try and do it in 3 minutes. I think we see post-Cold War three drivers of Turkish foreign policy. One is a tendency for revisionism. That existed, but it was suppressed, I think, under the Kemalist regime, if I can call it that. During the Cold War, the US was dominant, the Soviets were threatening, the focus was different, and still the legacy of Mustafa Kemal with a Western orientation was still prevalent. So that was controlled, but we see from the 90s growing tendency in the armed forces and in politics as well, increasing as it goes. The second driver is ideology. And things have become quite ideological, and we have a very dangerous mix of nationalism and increasing nationalism in Turkey, which you see all across the political divide. So you have nationalist parties in coalition, both with the AKP, but also with the CHP. And nationalism is becoming, I think, a driver. You saw this just yesterday when there was discussion of restarting talks with Greece, and the Turkish opposition, main opposition party, not some fringe party, accused AKP and President Erdogan of selling out to the Greeks, and I don't know what else. Now, this nationalism has come to be combined with an Islamist dimension, which again puts a different twist on things. It's a combination of these driving forces have repercussions that go well beyond the bilateral Greek-Turkish relation, but you see it in the Balkans, you see it very much in Syria and Iraq and the Gulf, with Israel and Libya, I mean, all across. And the third driver, which is less easy perhaps to quantify because we don't have all the givens, is the personal interest of Mr. Erdogan as regards his political, perhaps personal future, and as regards his legacy. And here we're coming up to dates, and we can come back to that if you want, because it has been mentioned both as a Turkish foreign policy goal, or reclaiming the lands that Turkey lost between 1911 and 1923, the centennial of 2023. And this, I think, is a deadline that creates pressures inside Turkey and as a result outside Turkey. Now, Greece has, to come to what Sinan was saying, Greece has been in favor of an open relationship with Turkey. Greece has said that we want to keep open channels, have a constructive dialogue. There has been dialogue which has been interrupted in the last 4 years, more or less. I hear now, just at the beginning of a webinar, I got a message that following the discussions between Mr. Erdogan, Mrs. Merkel, and Mr. Michel, it looks like the Turkish side will be coming on board for the exploratory talks. Greece has already said that we are ready to begin those, and the chief negotiator on the Greek side has been named. It's somebody who's very well known to the Turkish side, as he has engaged also in the past in these negotiations. So that is good news, I would say. And there will be also, I suppose, these trilateral discussions that Germany, Greece, and Turkey at the Sherpa level, at the diplomatic advisors, Mr. Kalin and Ambassador Surani from the Greek side. Now, as to what is to be discussed, Greece is prepared to go to the International Court of Justice following discussions that can get us there. The objective of these discussions should be the delimitation of maritime zones. And if we get this done, it'll already be a major step. As Sinan said, Greece is not too keen to discuss its sovereignty over Greek islands and such like that the Turkish side has been, putting forward in the last.
Sorry, Terry, I didn't say that we want to discuss the sovereignty of the Greek islands.
No, you didn't.
There's no issue.
Yeah,
there's no issue with regard to the sovereignty of the Greek islands. Please don't misquote me.
Not for you, but if you talk to Mr. Bahçeli, who had a big fiesta the other day regarding the
Mr. Bahçeli is not part of these direct negotiations.
He's a partner in your government, and others. I mean, other even officials. There are questions that are very unpalatable to Greece and will not be acceptable. So starting exploratory talks again is a good step. We're hoping that the mixed signals that are coming out of Turkey with reference to Oruç Reis, the research vessel, veer towards the correct side, because one argument is it's back there. The other argument was, no, it's just there for repairs and it'll soon go back out and do its thing. So we have to wait and see how that goes. But at least we seem to be on the bilateral aspect with reference to this sort of more narrow aspect, which is what we see as the main difference with Turkey to be discussed, going for the time being in the right direction.
Terry, let me ask you, where and how does Greece build leverage in all this? I mean, for me, it's very interesting to follow the debates within NATO, but especially the EU over this. I mean, could NATO, for instance, given that both Greece and Turkey are members, should NATO take a risk, act as a mediator, agent of the de-escalation? We saw that Air Marshal Stuart Peach, took a stab at it from very military confidence building and de-escalation. Is it a risk for NATO? Is it actually an opportunity? And at the same time, when we look at the EU, there is an argument that the EU should clearly take the side of Greece, that the EU, Germany in particular and others should not seek to mediate, but they should actually, strengthen Greece's position. Whereas actually a number of people, also within the EU, are quite critical, for instance, of the French embrace of the Greek position, which I suspect is a major lever for Greece at this point, given the French military deployment and the fact that President Macron has had some of the harshest words against President Erdogan. But this is creating some trouble within the EU. I mean, I'm just curious, how does Greece navigate that? How does it build leverage? You explained that we're hopefully in a better place right now because both parties seems to have agreed to a bilateral discussion. But can you walk us a bit through the politics of the EU and NATO as seen from Greece?
Sure. Building leverage. Look, with reference to the European Union, it's our natural family. I mean, Greece is a long-standing member of the EU. We're talking about 40 years now, more or less, and it's normal that we discuss things inside the EU and seek EU solidarity. After all, it's in the treaties. So it's on that basis that discussions are held. There may be varying views on different things. There always are in the EU. We are talking about, a large number of democratic states coming together in a union. a union that is coming closer and closer together, but nonetheless, where states still have views and where they exercise those views. But we have received a fair amount of solidarity from EU member states, from our partners in the EU, not only France. Let me just, if you want to sort of separate some out, let me also talk about the EU Med 7 that recently had their meeting in Corsica, where the messages were quite clear. But the messages have been quite clear coming out of the either the Council or the European Council since last spring, with reference to what was happening in the Eastern Mediterranean, both as regards Greece and as regards the Republic of Cyprus. So yes, so we discuss with the presidency, we discuss with our fellow members, and we'll see where we land. But what we're looking for is not strong words against Turkey. What we are looking for is a resolution of the problems. And in that respect, Turkey is part of the discussion. Turkey is a candidate country, which I'm sorry, but Ankara remembers rather selectively recently. I do have a certain degree of understanding as to the selectivity, but nonetheless, I think Turkey needs to make up its mind a little more strongly as to the direction it wants to go to. And I'll go back to my three drivers of policy that I mentioned before. As regards of leverage, of course, Greece can and will stand on its own 2 feet when it has to, and I think it has demonstrated that. And also Greece is building strong friendships in the region, because this is what Greek foreign policy does. I mean, we do not seek conflict, we seek cooperation with all our neighbors. Last but not least, our relationship with the United States, our strategic relationship with the United States is growing stronger in the last few days. We're again expecting Mr. Pompeo to come to Greece on Sunday, I think it is, or on Thursday maybe. He's going to Thessaloniki, and he's also going to Crete. So there's ongoing discussions that also include the matters we are discussing today with a number of actors to try and calm the situation down, but also bring this to a constructive solution and within the framework of international law.
And put your NATO hat just for a moment on this one. I'm curious about, is NATO better off staying out of it as an organization? I mean, is there something at a more technical level below the radar that can be done that de-escalate tensions?
Well, yeah, I haven't quite gotten rid of my NATO hat, so it's easy to put it back on. Look, there was a discussion last week, I think, at the Council on these issues. The thing with NATO is that NATO is an organization that functions on the basis of consensus. So decision-making has all the advantages, but also disadvantages that consensus brings with it. So who would be doing the arbitrating, negotiating, and so on and so forth? The Secretary General does have a role to play, but also he is at the mercy, if I may say so, of the Council. So his ability to deal with this and also his strong urge, let me put it this way, both institutional but also personal, as we see, to remain equidistant, kind of limit his ability to intervene in the matter. On the technical side, yes, both Greece and Turkey have accepted discussions at the military level that you mentioned. And I believe there was going to be at least a meeting even today between the military representatives of the two countries and Sir Stuart Peach to take this forward. This is rather a technical thing, you know, hotlines and safe distances and telling everybody where you are and where you're going. And, you know, the thing is, if we want to be optimistic, this can help. If we want to be a little less optimistic or more realistic, it's good to have such a mechanism, but in my personal opinion, it presupposes a degree of political will, which, if it exists, could make the need for such a mechanism defunct, you know. But anyway, it's not a bad idea to continue these discussions at the military level, and hopefully they can also add something positive to the equation. Thank you,
Terry. Yes, Sinan, you wanted to jump in quickly?
Just 10 seconds, if I may. Terry is obviously a very keen and experienced observer of Turkey and Turkish politics and Turkish foreign relations. The only thing that I would caution him against is that don't extrapolate too much in terms of the future direction of Turkish foreign policy from the domestic debate that you obviously monitor so well. Some of these voices have no impact on foreign policy of Turkey. The same, I mean, we've seen similar voices in the past in Greece as well with some of these more maximalist positions and parties.
Thank you. Terry, you keep it to 5 seconds and then
5 seconds. I can only wish and pray that Sinan is right. Unfortunately, he also knows how the institutions that held a good part of the foreign policy planning and execution in Turkey have been weakened and
thank you.
Revamped in the last 4 years. So I hope he's right, but I'm a little less optimistic on that scope than I would have been 4 years ago.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Ellen and ask one simple question. Is this dispute and the way it's unfolding, is it another example of what happens when the US steps back? I mean, you know, is this kind of crisis, you know, not that it wouldn't have existed 10, 20 years before, but is it that powerful, and is it creating those alignments in the region, in part, not precisely, but in part because the US in a way has retreated from the oversight and possible management of these relations?
Well, first, I think the American retrenchment from the region has been happening and is happening in slow and gradual ways. It is not an abrupt announcement that we're withdrawing all our forces, although, of course, serially, we have withdrawn from Iraq. We're now withdrawing from there have been a series, even we had a presence in Saudi Arabia that we withdrew. So the ins and outs of American robust presence in the region is a long story. But for sure, there is a redistribution of power, and the regional actors now see that they have more capacity to set the agenda themselves. In theory, this is a good thing. I mean, I would say from President Clinton on, Americans have wanted to see greater regional ownership of regional problems and a sort of reluctant hegemonic behavior on the part of the United States, that we didn't want to be setting the agenda or et cetera, but we found that the parties were, you know, increasingly, were just by default dependent on the United States. It's certainly true in the Gulf countries that benefited enormously from American investment and presence in the region. They are now feeling more confident that they can set the agenda themselves. Having said that, I think some of the turbulence and some of the realignments that are going on in the region also fit into American interests, if you will. So cooperation, among the like-minded countries that brings Israel into closer cooperation with Arab states, that's a good thing from a US perspective. The energy story, of course, is complicated because the US, in theory, cares less about the energy requirements of other countries as long as we've satisfied our own energy needs. So there's this rhetorical stance that because the United States is technically energy independent, that we don't care. I find that argument sort of overly stated, oversimplistic, because the US still has a big stake in stable energy markets, et cetera, you know, for regional stability purposes. But I simply take your point that there is a level of turbulence in the region that is generated in part by uncertainty of whether the United States is still the security guarantor of the region, whether the United States will somehow come in as the deus ex machina and try to solve regional problems. Turkey's rise, by the way, in general, was seen as not an unfavorable thing from an American interest perspective, but even though President Trump and President Erdogan enjoy, I guess, a sort of close personal relationship, Turkey's rise is also creating a little bit of, you know, ruffled feathers in Washington. If we look at Secretary Pompeo's recent visit to Cyprus, for example, he had some words of caution to the Turks. He said, you know, we expect the resources in the region to be developed for shared benefit, not for the benefit of one country.
I mean, on this, you mentioned the visit of Secretary Pompeo, and Terry mentioned the upcoming one to Greece, I mean, which is important. Mm-hmm. You know, this is a kind of a crisis where, you know, in the past there was an expectation that not necessarily US hegemony, but US shuttle diplomacy would be part of the picture. That you would have the Secretary of State visiting, then the Assistant Secretary would spend 2 weeks in the region, and then all that. I mean, first, is this going to happen? Or the second thing, is there actually an urge in Washington? Is there, you know, an interest in the administration, but also beyond, in being engaged in such, you know, crisis management situations? I'm just asking because, you know, whether it's 1974 or NATO politics or whatever, the US used to be a lot more engaged than it is right now. And every time, I mean, it's quite striking. The main external actors that everyone in the Q&A list and elsewhere are talking about is actually France. Not you know, not the US per se. And it's an exaggeration for effect on my part, but you know, it is. I mean, would a different Secretary of State, you know, in a future administration come January 2021, approach this issue differently, or is it up to regional actors, as you say, to come together? If Chancellor Merkel manages to put it off, that's one big success for German foreign policy. Suspect that American policymakers would be relieved that someone else is taking on the portfolio. So I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I certainly agree with respect to Greece and Turkey that we don't see that the United States is jumping in saying, you know, we have important relations. We are the sort of most logical actor to try to calm these waters. As you point out, the United States in the past, certainly in the 70s and even well into the 80s, the US kind of was the lead actor in adjudicating between Greece and Turkey, sometimes under NATO auspices, but more often bilaterally. But your point about crisis management, we don't really see it with a few exceptions. So the exceptions, you know, Secretary Tillerson did try to intervene on when the dispute between Qatar and the rest of the GCC broke out, but he didn't have the skills that a Secretary Kerry would have had to do that continual crisis diplomacy, the shuttle diplomacy going back and forth. Personally, I thought that was already a sign of a diminished American role, that we could have, in the first weeks of that crisis, in the good old days, probably been able to, you know, ward off it becoming so frozen and kind of institutionalized. But then we have to give credit where it's due. Jared Kushner is the closest thing we have to a shuttle diplomat. And, you know, whether we all thought that the peace plan was a very hollow, you know, rhetorical gesture that was never going to be implemented to achieve the independent state of Palestine, but in fact, there was a sort of secondary benefit to it, which was this normalization of relations with at least 2 Gulf countries. So it's not that there's no interest in American diplomacy, but it is less robust and less hardy and less automatic than I think it was in the past. And Secretary Pompeo's interests are very, driven by his own. There's an ideological agenda, there's his own personal political agenda of running for president one day. So he has been very active, traveling the world, but tends to see things in very nationalistic and, only wants to do business on a bilateral basis. He doesn't seem to be deeply invested in multilateralism.
Thank you. Just looking at the regional picture, which you've alluded to, there's it's quite striking, the alignment of interest that we see now between, Egypt, Israel, a couple of Gulf countries, notably the UAE, Cyprus, Greece. Some of it has a formal dimension, some of it has an informal dimension. First, where is Israel in this? Is this primarily about energy? Is it about, strategic relationships developing strategic relationships at a key moment in a way, where it does have a lot of US goodwill, or at least from this administration? And second, what about Egypt and the Gulf countries? Is this primarily about containing Turkey, or is it about solidifying their relationship with Israel? It could be both.
Well, many people think that in these waning days of Bibi Netanyahu's dominance of Israeli politics for so long, that Israel does not really have a very, dynamic foreign policy. It's using economics and its technological edge to do some very smart things. And Israel clearly is a successful globalized country in the age of globalization. These normalizations with the Gulf countries may have some commercial and economic, but there's no larger political vision. We do not see Bibi as having a kind of more ambitious agenda for Israel's integration into its region. Some of this has just happened over time, in part because the Gulf countries changed their views of, they reallocated their own priorities. But I would say that Israel, probably like Greece, wishes that this was not all done in such a binary black and white isolation of Turkey. They would probably rather that any expansion of regional cooperation finds a way to bring the Turks in. So I don't think the Israelis benefit completely from the isolation of Turkey. I think they would rather have the regional integration over the gas finds find a way to bring Turkey in. But on the Arab side, I think we are at a moment where there's a sharpening and hardening of Arab views about Turkey that is a new kind of core reality of the region. It is really striking to me that 10 days ago, the Arab League voted on a statement calling Turkey the most significant emerging threat to the region. And the 4 countries that abstained on the vote, just to give you a sense of whether Turkey really has friends and partners in the region, the 4 countries were Qatar, where there's a Turkish military base, Libya, where the Turks have deployed military forces, Somalia, where the Turks have been very dominant in peacekeeping and security cooperation, and Djibouti. So Turkey does not have it's not like the Arab states are divided and half of them are pro-Turkey and half of them are anti-Turkey. The center of gravity is strongly looking at Turkey, as they have looked at Iran for many years, as truly a threat to Arab world interests.
Interestingly, Ellen, what you say is true, and it reflects elite and state views of Turkey. At the same time, when you look at, for instance, the Arab Barometer and others, President Erdogan remains quite popular, at a, let's say, street level. So, there's a tension here, like on other issues, but I'm not saying that it has any operational policy effect. And just one quick thing, is this, you talked about Israel's perspective on Turkey and how it wants Turkey to be to stay part of this security architecture. Is this the reason why Turkish-Israeli military security relations seems to be surviving despite, Mavi Marmara and all, I start with this, but all the other tensions. It's quite striking that there's still there seems to be a functioning security relationship between the two. And I'm curious what Sinan has to say about that.
So I've always thought there was a pragmatic dimension, right from look, in 1948, Turkey, recognized Israel. Israel has always, the Ben Gurion idea of you deal with the non-Arab states on the outer perimeter, provide a kind of security, structure for Israel. So I think both Turkey and Israel have been reluctant to give up some of the technocratic cooperation if they can keep it under the radar screen. It doesn't get caught up in high-level politics. I think there's a mutual interest in keeping some of that going. Having said that, Erdogan's rhetoric sometimes, I think, makes it politically very, hard for the Israelis. The Israelis want to keep as much normality as they can in the relationship with Turkey, but there is these political frictions do enter into it.
Sinan, would you agree with Ellen on this?
Yeah, by and large, and I think fundamentally, given how much turbulence we have witnessed in our region, these two states, Turkey and Israel, have also very common challenges and viewpoints about the threat landscape that they see, that relate to the rise of extremism, of Islam, entities like the Islamic State, fragile and failed states. Fight against proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So there's so many actually common areas of concern that throughout the political ups and downs of this relationship, some of that more perhaps confidential, sensitive collaboration remained in force. And the visible part of that was less the security cooperation, but the commercial links. When you look at the trade developments between those two countries, they mushroomed despite all these, political recriminations.
Thank you. Terry?
Well, I mean, this brings, I see what Elaine is saying and Sinan, but I'm going back to look at this from the perspective of the three driving factors that I said, or three drivers that I was speaking about earlier, and how the Arabs, Israel, and their relationship vis-a-vis Turkey sort of comes together. Let me start, let's say, from Libya. I mean, Turkey has been involved in Libya. It is not something that happened, a few months ago or a year ago when Haftar's forces were on the outskirts of Tripoli. Turkey has had very close relations, especially with some of the militias in Libya, not least the Misrata militia, which Turkey has been supplying with weapons now at least since 2013. There are other reasons why this relationship exists, but also the common link of, the link, let's say, provided by the Muslim Brotherhood leanings of Misrata is also an important factor. This does not augur well, obviously, as you know, in any Muslim Brotherhood links with the Egyptians and with the Emiratis and Saudis and the others. Then you have Turkey in Iraq, Turkey in Syria, with questionable at times relationships that have been built with, some of which Syrian relationships are now spilling over into Libya. Thirdly, and very importantly, you have Turkish links with Iran. There are financial, others, cooperation against the Kurds, and other links that are also creating anxieties, both in Israel and in the Gulf, to the extent that Yossi Cohen, who was then Mossad head 2 years ago, is reported to have said that, Iranian power is fragile, but the real threat is from Turkey, and that is reported. But you also see in January 2020, the Israel Defense Force annual assessment, which for the first time noted Turkey has become a challenge, quote unquote. So this also feeds into what is happening in the Gulf. it also feeds into the relationship that is building up between Gulf states and Israel, which also has other reasons. I mean, they're under the table security cooperation that has been going on for some years. So in a way, I mean, Turkey has been pivotal in creating dynamics that have advanced these types of relationships in the region.
I'm going to take some of the questions as well, and so trying to tie all this. So bear with me. There's a couple of questions about France's role in the region, and I'm curious, both from Sinan's perspective and Terry's perspective, how France is viewed. Just to plug myself, I wrote a long piece in July on the ISS website looking at France's role and the tensions with Turkey. But I'm curious, from your perspective, how do you assess the French political rhetoric, but also the military deployment in the region? So this is for both Sinan and Terry. And John, one question that often is raised is there a way to bring in Turkey into the East Med gas forum? Is that, a way, I mean, or is it designed, is this forum actually designed to keep Turkey out? I mean, I hear the two perspectives, so that this is not in the cards. I know that Sinan has written on this as well, but, I'll ask John to take the lead on this, and then we'll come back to you, Alan, if possible. So Sinan, France first.
Yeah, before France, just again, allow me 10 seconds to Terry's statements, because I thought, this last round, his reading was a bit too selective and partial about the direction of Turkish foreign policy. In order really to understand Turkish foreign policy, you have to look at the regional disorder that initially was created by the US intervention in Iraq. And then, of course, the rise into the Syria war, where Turkey's allies didn't respond to our needs and helped Turkey to intervene in Syria with a dimension that could have upended the dynamics on the ground. That led to the US, partnering with the PYD-PKK. So there are a lot of these elements that need to be taken into consideration in order to understand where Turkish foreign policy is heading. And that's why I meant it was a bit of a selective reading by doing the pick
10
and
seconds.
Shoot.
Can you move to France?
On France, the way that, of course, Turkey views the French role very negatively in the Eastern Mediterranean, because it is read as an unconditional support to the Greek position and some of the maximalist positions of Greece. It also creates a problem within the EU, as we've seen very recently, because you have these two lead nations, France going in one direction and Germany going in another direction. So the Turkish position is much closer to the German position, which is to incentivize bilateral talks. But what France is doing is by giving support to these, by a blind support to some of these claims, it is making those bilateral talks more difficult on the one hand. The second one is that, as it is also bringing a military dimension to the conflict, and therefore raises the risks of a military escalation in the Eastern Mediterranean, while being a NATO country. So I think, but still, I think this needs to be taken into consideration, not purely from the East Med angle, because there is another dimension of the Turkey-France relationship, in Libya, the French alliance with the UAE, and so on. So I think this is certainly, thought for another panel, and congratulations for your paper, by the way.
Thank you. Terry?
Well, I take Sinan's point on Iraq. I mean, it's a huge discussion, and I do agree that, the 2003 Iraq has had very negative, and I would even go as far as saying disastrous consequences for the region, even though I don't think that necessarily explains or excuses everything that Turkey has done in the region. But it is a factor, and I'm certainly willing to take that on board. As far as France is concerned, I think France, first of all, has always had an interest in the Eastern Mediterranean, as a Lebanese would know. First of all, France has not been.
I'm half French as well, so careful what you say.
All the more then, all the more, you know, and in Syria as well, up to a point. So I think there is a genuine concern there. Secondly, I think there are other concerns. For instance, Libya. I think that France, and not only France, shudders to think what would happen if there was Turkish control in Libya as well, which would mean that Turkey would control both major migratory flows towards Europe, especially after what happened on the Greek-Turkish border last February and March. And thirdly, the military dimension that Sinan, I don't think, what is it, the French who brought the military dimension in? I mean, they're not the ones who started bringing the military dimension, and you mentioned NATO as well. Let's not forget what happened a couple of months ago now, 2.5 months ago, when a French frigate was painted by Turkish frigates, according to what the French are saying, when France tried to inspect a ship heading for Libya under Turkish military escort, and France being, then acting under Operation Sea Guardian, which is a NATO operation. So, there's been a fair amount.
On that one, though, Terry, you know that, within NATO, it doesn't seem like, the other allies were necessarily backing the French position. On the contrary.
No, I think that the allies tried, there's a strong spirit of solidarity within NATO, including for Turkey and including by Greece for Turkey with reference to Syria and so on and so forth. So the spirit of solidarity is still there, and allies in that spirit, but also under the consensus rule, I don't think they took sides, basically. There I would agree with you, but this also speaks more of NATO rather than of what actually happened in that part of the Mediterranean on that fateful day.
Thank you. John, I always turn to you for hope. Is bringing Turkey into the East Med gas forum, a pie in the sky? Is it something that, would provide some technical fix for the escalation? There's a lot of this. Is it a club that is designed to keep Turkey out?
I wish I could tell you otherwise, but it really is a coalition against Turkey in terms of gas. You
disappoint me, John.
I'm so sorry. Its objective is to build a pipeline, the East Mediterranean gas pipeline, which will never happen for commercial reasons. But I think returning to, I offered this idea less definitively, but as Sinan said, this condominium idea. That can always happen at any time. And, why can't there be economic, commercial cooperation? And many geopolitical rivals do it, and they enrich themselves through trade. And there's just nothing wrong with that. So there's a little bit of positivity for you.
Ellen, is that something, for instance, that the US would encourage? Trying to get the parties to focus on the commercial, economic benefits of energy cooperation, to try to, no one is saying that, these things can be solved in the near future, right? Everything I'm hearing, turning to an international court or bilateral negotiation, this is going to take a lot of time. Is that where the US can and should focus its attention on?
Well, I think it fits naturally in how the Trump administration has looked at the region. If you can find sort of mutual economic interests and let the private sector play, then sometimes, they, I think, overstate the degree to which economic benefit will substitute for politics. The politics still is there, but I'm completely in agreement with John that you may see very practical commercial activity going on that doesn't solve the political problems at all, but can coexist, that can somehow uneasily coexist. I do think the United States sees, developing energy is a shared opportunity, but I think they probably believe more than maybe they should that this will somehow drive the politics. That was certainly the logic of the Trump administration's Middle East plan, that you could sort of compensate the Palestinians. You know, you won't get the political outcome you want, but you'll be more prosperous, and won't that be good enough? You know, that was kind of the logic of it. But I wanted to just go back to this consolidating of Arab fear of Turkey and, you know, belief that Turkey is a threat. And here, the energy issue is really a second-tier issue. The exploitation of resources is mentioned, but the underlying issue is something that Terry mentioned that I should have mentioned earlier. The real fault line about Turkey is about the Muslim Brothers. It's about, you know, whether you're tolerant of political Islam or trying to, you know, defend against it. So look at this amazing role reversal that you have Saudi Arabia defending secular states against Islamist activity, and the once militantly secular Turkey being somehow more tolerant and inclusive about political Islam. But that's a deep fault line. That explains a bit of Syria, it explains a bit of Libya, but it certainly explains current Egyptian policy, that they're with the Saudis and the Emiratis in seeing the Turkish threat as partly a threat that's related to the Ikhwan al-Muslimin.
Let me ask another question of both you and Terry that our participants have put forward, and it has to do with Russia. I mean, one of the big takes these days is that, look, Russia has established itself in Syria. It is now building a presence in Libya. The conflict there has allowed both Turkey and Russia to be, you know, prominent powers in both Libya and Syria. It benefits from this tension within NATO between Turkey and Greece. That the strategic concern right now is actually a Russian presence on the southern flank in the Mediterranean. First to Ellen, is that how, you know, an audience in Washington would see that, and is it an impetus to try to solve this as fast as possible, that Russia could emerge as a beneficiary of all that? And I don't know if that's the case. I'm just putting it out. And to Terry, I mean, you know, again, your hat on NATO is still on your head. I can see it right now. Is that a prominent issue? I mean, you know, or is it because the ties between Cyprus and Russia, or, you know, Greece and Russia, but also perhaps Turkey and Russia, which, you know, are sometimes competitors, but sometimes partners, is that also an element of the discussion? Ellen first.
So I think how the United States organizes itself in the face of increased both Russian and Chinese activism in the Middle East is really an evolving story that there's no clarity here yet. It does seem to me that the Trump administration is trying to demonstrate that it deeply disapproves of certain Russian nefarious deeds. It even mentioned it in Cyprus about money laundering and things like that. But we have not objected formally to Russian diplomacy, because sometimes its diplomacy on Syria has been seen as, on balance, maybe better than what the UN is trying to do. So the Biden administration, if we look at the Biden campaign folks, they also look like they are, they're not seeing Russian involvement in the Middle East as an existential threat to the United States. They're seeing that if the Russians play their diplomatic hand well, in the interest of regional security, we can probably live with that. We're not going to turn that into an ideological contest with the Russians. If the Russians were to start establishing military bases in the region beyond what they have in Syria, maybe that would raise the threshold and it would generate a regional reaction that might bring the US back in more strongly. But at this point, Russian diplomacy per se is not being seen as necessarily a threat to vital American interests.
And Terry? Just kidding.
Well, I'm not sure I understood the question with connection to NATO. I mean, I would agree with what Ellen has said. If the question is, what's the discussion inside NATO, and the relationship with Greece, Cyprus being not a NATO member, doesn't come into play, makes any difference or something. I think that the understanding is that basically Russia is happy to see NATO divided. So if cooperation with Turkey helps to that end, I don't think they are disappointed. And we see tensions with reference to that cooperation. I'm talking about the cooperation between Turkey and Russia, especially on the S-400s, manifesting itself as much in Brussels, NATO, as in Washington. But the Russia-Turkey relationship I see more as transactional in many ways. And you see the differences between what's happening in Syria and what's happening in Libya. So I don't think it goes far beyond that for now, as I would say.
Okay, so thank you very much to everyone. We just hit the 90 minutes mark. You know, as I said, I expected John to provide us with some good news. So instead, I'm going to do it. This is the best perspective on the Eastern Mediterranean you can find, and it just shows you there's still beauty and richness and things. If you guess what it is, you know, to our participants, you know, you'll win something. I'll figure out what the ISS has to give you. But more seriously, thank you very much to the four panelists for this very rich discussion. It was good. It was layered. So thank you very much. Thank you to all the participants who stayed. I you know, noticed that a lot of people who have deep expertise are on the call. So I'm sure they learned something, but also you provided them food for thought. So thank you very much to John, Alan, Terry, and Sinan. And come back to the ISS or read their many works to learn more on this. Thank you.